Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez had just told millions of viewers that Marco Rubio's own mother might not recognize the man her son had become. She delivered the line with the confidence of someone who believed the most damaging moment of the hearing already belonged to her. Rubio's mother had been dead since 2019, a fact that transformed the remark from an aggressive policy attack into something colder, cheaper, and far more personal than the subject before the committee required. The gallery did not laugh because there was nothing clever about using a dead woman as political ammunition. The sudden gasp in the room carried the unmistakable sound of an audience realizing that a rehearsed attack had crossed into territory even partisan television usually avoids. The clip began spreading almost immediately because Ocasio-Cortez understood better than most members of Congress how to manufacture a moment that could be cut, captioned, uploaded, and converted into millions of views before the hearing had even ended. For roughly 90 seconds, it looked as though she had succeeded because the insult was already moving faster than the facts. And in modern politics, that is often all a politician needs. The hearing had technically been called to examine Western Hemisphere policy, including sanctions on Venezuela, trade restrictions involving Cuba, and the administration's broader approach to immigration and regional security. Ocasio-Cortez had arrived prepared to turn those subjects into an indictment of Rubio, the son of Cuban immigrants, who now served as Secretary of State and represented the foreign policy machinery she had come to attack. Her opening was quick, practiced, and built for distribution, moving from immigration enforcement to Cuba sanctions and then to children in detention with the tight pacing of a team that had rehearsed every transition. She was not merely questioning a cabinet official because questioning officials is slow, technical, and usually boring. She was building a piece of content designed to leave the room and dominate every screen outside it. Then she tilted her chin, looked directly at Rubio, invoked his mother's years cleaning hotel rooms, and suggested that the woman who had worked to give him a future would now be ashamed of what he had become. That was the line meant to end the exchange, the polished detonation after the buildup. But instead it created 8 seconds of silence that exposed how badly Ocasio-Cortez had misjudged both the room and the man sitting across from her. Rubio did not interrupt, raise his voice, pound the table, or give her the furious reaction that could have allowed her supporters to dismiss him as defensive and emotional. He looked down at the table with his hands resting flat against the wood, not because he had no answer, but because he understood that any answer given too quickly would sound like politics when the subject was his dead mother. 8 seconds inside a hearing room filled with microphones is not empty time, because every pause becomes visible, every breath becomes part of the record, and every person watching begins to anticipate what will follow. When Rubio finally spoke, he did not begin with policy, immigration, Venezuela, Cuba, or the administration. He began with the one fact Ocasio-Cortez had treated as a prop. His mother's name was Aurealis, he said. She had cleaned rooms at the Rooney Plaza Hotel in Miami Beach, ironed other people's sheets so he could sleep in his own, arrived legally from Cuba with nothing, worked until her body could no longer continue, and died in 2019. The words were not elaborate, and they did not need to be, because the force came from their simplicity and from the humiliating contrast between a son stating his mother's life plainly and a congresswoman reducing that life to a weapon. Rubio explained that his mother could not defend herself against what had just been said, so he would defend her, and the room shifted away from spectacle towards something Ocasio-Cortez's team had not prepared to confront. He did not cry, perform outrage, or demand an apology, because emotion would have allowed the hearing to return to the familiar swamp of competing interpretations, wounded feelings, and partisan arguments. Instead, he reached for a binder, and the binder changed the nature of the confrontation because anger disappears after the clip ends, while federal records remain available long after the applause stops. Rubio said his mother would not have been ashamed of him, but she might have questioned how a congresswoman representing hundreds of thousands of Latino constituents had spent 7 years and roughly $27 million in campaign funds. He made clear that he was not about to attack Ocasio-Cortez's relatives, background, or family history because the subject he intended to examine was narrower, colder, and considerably harder to dismiss: her campaign finances. In that moment, the entire preparation behind her performance became useless because her staff had assembled arguments about Venezuela, Cuba, sanctions, immigration, and foreign policy, not answers to a live reading of Federal Election Commission filings. The insult against Rubio's mother had opened a door that was supposed to remain closed, and Rubio walked through it without theatrics, carrying documents rather than slogans and numbers rather than outrage. Ocasio-Cortez had wanted the emotional advantage of making his family part of the hearing, but once she made family relevant, she surrendered control over where the response could go. Rubio began with Brand New Congress LLC, the limited liability company created by Saikat Chakrabarti, Ocasio-Cortez's former chief of staff, former campaign manager, and one of the central figures in the political organization that helped build her national career. He stated that between 2018 and 2020, Ocasio-Cortez's campaign committee and two affiliated political action committees, Justice Democrats PAC and Brand New Congress PAC, paid approximately $900,000 to that company. Each disbursement, according to the records Rubio cited, carried the same broad description: strategic consulting, two words capable of covering almost anything while explaining almost nothing. $900,000 had been moved under a label so conveniently vague that the public was expected to accept the category without asking what services were actually purchased, who performed them, or why they cost nearly $1 million. That kind of description may satisfy a political press office accustomed to repeating campaign language, but it becomes much less comfortable when someone begins comparing it with what the company's own founder publicly said the organization actually did. Rubio then cited Chakrabarti's explanation that Brand New Congress LLC had created campaign infrastructure and operated fundraising and volunteer activities for campaigns. That description did not sound like occasional advice from an outside consultant because it sounded like the basic machinery of campaign operations, the systems and personnel responsible for keeping a political organization functioning. The distinction was not cosmetic, and Rubio refused to let it be buried beneath the usual Washington habit of treating every reporting discrepancy as a technical misunderstanding that ordinary people are too unsophisticated to understand. Federal campaign reports require committees to disclose how donor money is spent, and describing campaign operations as strategic consulting does more than soften the language, because it can conceal the actual nature of the work from donors, regulators, journalists, and voters. Rubio's point was brutally simple. When the person running the company says it performed campaign operations, but the federal forms repeatedly describe the payments as strategic consulting, the contradiction does not disappear merely because the wording sounds professional. He turned the page and continued, without giving Ocasio-Cortez the opportunity to drag the exchange back toward immigration policy, because the issue was no longer whether she could deliver another sharp line, but whether she could explain the lines already filed under her campaign's name. Rubio cited the public assessment of a former Federal Election Commission official who had argued that the original complaint contained more than enough evidence to justify a civil investigation. He emphasized that the official had also said the Justice Department should seriously consider whether the matter warranted criminal examination, and he underlined that those were not accusations invented during the hearing for dramatic effect. They were the published judgment of someone familiar with the agency responsible for enforcing campaign finance law, which made them considerably more difficult to dismiss than the usual partisan statements traded between congressional offices. Ocasio-Cortez had started the confrontation by questioning whether Rubio's mother would recognize his character, and Rubio was now questioning whether her own donors would recognize what their money had financed. The Federal Election Commission had dismissed the earlier complaint in 2022, but Rubio immediately stripped away the comforting implication that dismissal meant complete vindication. The commission had divided 3-3, which meant the matter ended in a deadlock rather than in a unified finding that the conduct was proper, accurately reported, or unworthy of examination. A procedural closure is not the same thing as exoneration, no matter how aggressively a campaign press release tries to compress those two very different outcomes into the same sentence. 3 commissioners believed there was enough basis to proceed, 3 did not, and the file closed because the agency lacked the votes required to move forward, not because every underlying question had been answered. Rubio had not yet reached the later payments, the psychiatrist, the apology, or the fallout, but the first section of the binder had already accomplished what Ocasio-Cortez's viral insult could not. It replaced performance with a record, and the record was only beginning. Rubio moved from the deadlocked Federal Election Commission complaint to Rosa Gutierrez, a laundromat owner in Corona, Queens, because abstract regulations become much harder to ignore when placed beside the life of a real person who follows them. Rosa had immigrated from the Dominican Republic in 1997, spent 26 years building a small business, paid roughly $41,000 a year in taxes, and watched her 19-year-old daughter Sophia study at Kunwai with the help of student loans. She had voted for Ocasio-Cortez in 2018 because she believed the Congresswoman was like the people she represented, not merely culturally familiar on television, but financially accountable in the ordinary way. Working families are forced to be accountable every day. Rosa's taxes helped fund the Congresswoman's $174,000 salary, while Rosa herself remains subject to the kind of enforcement system that can notice a minor inconsistency, issue a letter, demand documents, and treat a $200 discrepancy as a matter requiring immediate explanation. Rubio's comparison was deliberately unforgiving. Rosa had been audited over $200, while approximately $900,000 had been reported under language that did not appear to match the campaign operations described by the company's own founder. That was the double standard. Rubio wanted the room to confront, not in the vague language of economic inequality, but in the specific language of who gets questioned, who gets protected, and whose errors are treated as innocent until the public stops asking. A small business owner cannot tell the Internal Revenue Service that the description on a form should be interpreted generously because the underlying purpose was complicated, because ordinary Americans are expected to write the truth in the box provided and live with the consequences when they do not. Political organizations, however, routinely surround questionable reporting with consultants, compliance firms, attorneys, and public statements designed to make the clearest contradiction sound too technical for normal voters to judge. Rubio's argument was that Rosa did not need a law degree to understand the problem, because she already understood the rule that governs every honest business. Call the expense what it actually is, document where the money went, and do not expect sympathy when the paperwork says one thing while the people involved say another. By placing Rosa beside the campaign, Rubio transformed the issue from a partisan complaint into an indictment of privilege because the woman sending money and paying taxes appeared to face stricter standards than the politician claiming to speak for her. Then Rubio turned to the next tab, and the numbers became smaller than $900,000, but more personally dangerous because the issue was no longer only how campaign operations had been described. In March 2026, the National Legal and Policy Center had filed another complaint with the Federal Election Commission and the Office of Congressional Conduct concerning 3 payments made by Ocasio-Cortez's campaign committee during 2025. The first payment, dated March 10, was $11,550. The second, dated May 15, was $2,800. And the third, dated October 1, was $4,375. Together, they totaled $18,725, and all 3 were reported as leadership training and consulting, language polished enough to suggest executive development, organizational coaching, or some other conventional campaign service. Rubio then identified the recipient as Dr. Brian B., a psychiatrist associated with Stella Mental Health, and the contrast between the reported description and the recipient's professional practice became the center of the allegation. Dr. 20, B was not publicly presented as a campaign strategist, leadership consultant, political trainer, or organizational development specialist. Rubio stated that his listed work involved psychiatric and therapeutic services. That did not automatically establish what services had been provided, but it created the obvious question the campaign's own reporting should have answered clearly before any outside organization was forced to ask it. Federal election law restricts the personal use of campaign money, and the governing test is whether the expense would exist regardless of the campaign, which means private medical or psychiatric treatment cannot simply be converted into a political expense by placing campaign language on the disclosure form. Rubio explained that if psychiatric services had been received and donor funds had paid for them, the problem would involve personal use of campaign resources. If those same services were then described as leadership training and consulting, the reporting itself could create a second problem, because one transaction would raise both a use of funds question and a disclosure question. The force of the point came from its simplicity, because Rubio did not need to embellish the allegation when the campaign's own description and the recipient's profession already stood beside each other on the public record. Ocasio-Cortez's attorney leaned forward and whispered to her, and the urgency of that brief exchange suggested that this was not the moment for improvisation, indignation, or another line designed to generate applause. The safest legal response was silence, because any spontaneous explanation could create a new inconsistency, acknowledge facts not yet established, or produce a clip that investigators and reporters would replay alongside the filings. Ocasio-Cortez followed that advice and said nothing. But silence inside a televised confrontation does not remain neutral, especially after a politician has spent years building a reputation around immediate, forceful answers. The woman who had entered the hearing prepared to interrogate Rubio on morality was now sitting quietly while he read payments from her own campaign reports, and no amount of posture could make that reversal look accidental. Rubio returned to Rosa Gutierrez because the issue was not merely what lawyers, commissioners, and compliance experts might call the payments, but what donors believed they were funding when they gave money they could barely spare. Rosa contributed $25 a month to Ocasio-Cortez's campaign, a modest amount by national fundraising standards, but a meaningful sacrifice for someone balancing rent, tuition, payroll, taxes, and the daily uncertainty of running a neighborhood business. She believed her contribution supported a political movement, community representation, campaign organizing, and the promises that had convinced her the Congresswoman remained connected to people who worked with their hands and counted every dollar. Part of that donor pool had been used for payments to a psychiatrist and reported as leadership training, and Rosa had not been told enough to know whether the description accurately reflected the service. Rubio's point was not that $25 bought Rosa control over the campaign, but that $25 entitled her to the truth about what the campaign claimed it purchased. He then turned back to the original insult because the financial records were not a separate performance pasted onto the hearing, but the direct answer to the personal standard Ocasio-Cortez had chosen to introduce. She had asked whether Rubio's mother would recognize him, and Rubio responded that his mother would recognize $900,000 routed through an LLC and labeled strategic consulting, even though the organization's own leader had described campaign infrastructure, fundraising, and volunteer operations. His mother had never attended law school, but she had spent a lifetime working around people who understood the difference between the name printed on a bill and the service actually delivered. She would also recognize $18,725 paid to a psychiatrist and described as leadership training because working people do not require expert commentary to notice when an official label appears designed to avoid a more uncomfortable description. Rubio's answer reduced the entire confrontation to one brutal standard. His mother knew the difference between what something was called and what it actually was. He said that in Spanish there was a word for deliberately calling something by the wrong name, and in English the word was even simpler, a lie. He argued that his mother would recognize the contradiction between a politician telling hundreds of thousands of Latino constituents that she was one of them, while donor money flowed toward private flights, four-star hotels, and a psychiatrist described as a leadership coach. His mother had cleaned rooms in those hotels, but had never entered them as a guest, and that distinction carried more force than any polished speech about class because it separated the laborer paying the cost from the political figure enjoying the access. Rubio insisted that his mother would recognize him as a man who filed forms correctly, named expenses honestly, and did not spend other people's money while pretending it had served some different purpose. The question was no longer whether Orialis Rubio would recognize her son, but whether Rosa Gutierrez still recognized the congresswoman she had trusted. Because the binder had exposed a version of the campaign Rosa had never believed her $25 was supporting. The room remained silent after Rubio finished asking whether Rosa Gutierrez still recognized the congresswoman she had trusted, because no staff memo, legal whisper, or prepared talking point could make the question disappear. Ocasio-Cortez had built her political identity around confrontation, and that instinct finally pushed her to respond, not because the financial questions had been answered, but because remaining silent any longer would have looked like surrender. She began carefully, saying she had not intended to disrespect Rubio's mother and that her criticism had been directed at policy rather than family. The apology was humanly necessary but politically disastrous, because it confirmed that the original remark had crossed the line she had spent the previous minutes pretending did not exist. Once she acknowledged the personal nature of the attack, Rubio's response no longer looked like an ambush unrelated to the hearing, but like the consequence of a door she had opened herself. Her words did not erase the insult, and they certainly did not erase the binder, because an apology can address cruelty, but cannot explain $900,000 in campaign payments. Rubio accepted the apology without gloating, without raising his voice, and without offering her the relief of turning the moment into another emotional argument. He answered softly that he appreciated it, then immediately asked whether the congresswoman wished to address the $900,000. The sentence was devastating because it separated the personal issue from the legal and financial one with surgical precision, leaving Ocasio-Cortez no room to pretend that remorse over Rubio's mother resolved the reporting questions. She had apologized for the attack, but now she had to decide whether she would answer the records, and the answer was that she would not. Ocasio-Cortez did not explain Brand New Congress LLC, did not reconcile the phrase strategic consulting with Chakrabarty's description of campaign operations, and did not address why the former FEC official believed the matter justified serious examination. She did not explain the payments to Dr. Brian B., the psychiatrist whose services had been reported as leadership training and consulting, nor did she identify what campaign-related work had supposedly been performed. Instead, she reached for the standard phrases politicians use when specificity becomes dangerous, calling the allegations politically motivated and insisting that her campaign had complied with disclosure requirements. She added that the American people could see through the attack, a familiar line intended to replace evidence with confidence and redirect attention from the form itself to the motives of the person reading it. It was verbal smoke from a machine that had lost power because every sentence sounded active while none of them answered the question actually asked. Rubio did not interrupt the boilerplate or debate the claim that the accusations were political, because politics had nothing to do with whether the numbers, recipients, and descriptions matched the public filings. He simply allowed her response to end, closed the binder, placed it on the table, and folded his hands as if the matter had moved beyond argument and entered the record. The physical presence of the binder now carried its own meaning, because everyone in the room understood that its pages contained documents that could be reviewed again after the cameras stopped. Ocasio-Cortez had arrived expecting to force Rubio into a defensive posture over immigration and Cuba, but she was leaving a hearing in which her own campaign disclosures had become the central subject. The attack, designed to make him look morally compromised, had instead placed her finances under a spotlight she could not dismiss with another viral phrase. She left through the main exit rather than slipping away through a side corridor, keeping her shoulders back and her expression controlled as reporters crowded the hallway. When the questions came, she offered only 4 words. "We'll have a statement," a phrase that sounded disciplined but revealed that no immediate answer existed. Her attorney was already on the phone, first with the campaign treasurer and then with the compliance firm responsible for preparing the reports, because the matter had shifted from public relations to document review. The central question was no longer how to defend the Congresswoman's tone, but whether the listed disbursements could withstand scrutiny under the descriptions filed with the Federal Election Commission. That conversation took place behind closed doors, and in Washington, a closed door after a public reading of federal records often says more than the statement eventually released from behind it. Inside the hearing room, a staff aide lifted the binder from the table and placed it into Rubio's briefcase, but the information inside it no longer belonged only to the people who had prepared the exchange. The 47 pages of FEC filings, financial disclosures, and complaint materials had been translated into television language, where numbers become clips and clips become public memory. Millions of viewers who had tuned in for a confrontation over Venezuela and immigration had instead watched a congresswoman invoke a dead mother and then refused to answer specific questions about campaign money. The sequence mattered, because audiences do not remember hearings as complete transcripts, but as simple narratives with clear turns, and this one had become brutally easy to summarize. She attacked his mother, he opened the binder, he read the payments, she apologized, and she never answered the receipts. 2 separate clips began spreading, and each damaged Ocasio-Cortez in a different way because they reached audiences with different reasons for caring. The first clip centered on Rubio saying his mother's name, describing her years cleaning hotel rooms and explaining that she had ironed other people's sheets so he could sleep in his own. That clip traveled as a family story rather than a partisan argument, reaching Latino households where the labor of immigrant mothers was not an abstraction but a daily memory. Rubio's decision to repeat part of the response in Spanish gave the moment another life across Spanish-language platforms where the emotional meaning required no explanation from campaign professionals. The clip did not ask viewers to agree with Rubio's foreign policy because it asked only whether bringing a dead mother into a televised attack had been decent. And on that question, Ocasio-Cortez had given millions of people an answer they did not like. The second clip began with a $900,000 move through the psychiatrist payments and ended with Rubio's quiet question about whether Ocasio-Cortez wished to address the money. That version spread through political finance accounts, compliance circles, FEC observers, and professionals who understood exactly why the descriptions on campaign reports mattered. Unlike the first clip, it did not depend on sympathy, family, or cultural identification, because its power came from the visible gap between the questions asked and the answers avoided. Campaign law professionals began describing the disclosures as inadequate at best and potentially actionable at worst, and the word actionable carried more weight than the usual flood of partisan adjectives. A viral insult can fade after a news cycle, but a discussion among people who file and interpret federal reports creates a different kind of pressure, one measured in letters, complaints, document requests, and deadlines. During the first week, Ocasio-Cortez's office released a statement accusing the administration of staging a political ambush to distract from what it called cruel immigration policies. The statement declared that all campaign disbursements had complied fully with Federal Election Commission regulations, but it did not identify the $900,000, explain the LLC structure, or describe the services provided by Dr. B. It did not address the former FEC official's public assessment, the difference between strategic consulting and campaign operations, or the use of leadership training language for payments to a psychiatrist. The office had produced a denial broad enough to sound confident and vague enough to avoid every dangerous detail, which is exactly how political statements are written when the specific facts are harder to defend than the general principle. Full compliance became the shield, but the shield had holes where every number Rubio had read remained visible. The Federal Election Commission soon received 14 formal requests to reopen the earlier complaint, and those requests did not all come from Republican operatives or organizations that could be dismissed as extensions of Rubio's political team. Campaign finance watchdogs pointed to the original 3-3 deadlock and argued that the case had never been resolved on the merits, only closed because the commission lacked a majority. With a differently constituted commission, the same underlying record could produce a different vote, and that possibility turned what Ocasio-Cortez's office called an old political attack into an active procedural threat. The apology had not contained the fallout, the statement had not answered the documents, and the viral clips had ensured that millions of people now understood enough of the case to keep asking the same question. Rubio had closed the binder inside the hearing room, but outside that room, the file was opening again. By the second week, the Office of Congressional Conduct had opened a preliminary inquiry focused narrowly on the $18,725 paid to Dr. Brian B. because broad statements about compliance were no longer enough to settle a question that had become painfully specific. The inquiry did not declare guilt, issue a charge, or reach a final conclusion, but it demanded answers to matters Ocasio-Cortez's public statement had carefully avoided. Were the payments made for legitimate campaign services, and if so, what exact services had a psychiatrist with no publicly listed background in leadership training provided to the campaign? If the services were personal, why had donor money been used? And if they were campaign-related, why had the campaign chosen reporting language that concealed rather than clarified the recipient's professional role? Those were not partisan slogans, and they could not be defeated by calling Rubio cruel, distracted, dishonest, or politically motivated, because each question was anchored to a payment, a date, a recipient, and a federal disclosure. A preliminary inquiry may sound gentle to people unfamiliar with congressional enforcement, but the softness is procedural, not meaningless, because the office possesses the authority to request records, interview witnesses, and refer findings when the documents justify further action. Reporters can ask questions and receive statements, while an ethics office can demand supporting material and compare internal invoices with the descriptions placed on public filings. That difference changes the behavior of every attorney, treasurer, consultant, and compliance officer connected to a campaign, because public relations can tolerate ambiguity while sworn records cannot. Ocasio-Cortez's team could continue repeating that every payment complied with the law, but investigators would not be grading confidence, tone, or ideological consistency. They would be examining invoices, correspondence, contracts, scopes of work, and the exact explanation for why psychiatric payments had been described to donors and regulators as leadership training. Latino media continued covering the confrontation, but the coverage no longer centered primarily on sanctions, Venezuela, immigration enforcement, or the technical structure of campaign finance law. It centered on the sentence that had caused everything else. Ocasio-Cortez had touched Rubio's mother, a woman who had died years earlier and could not answer the accusation made in her name. One Univision commentator reduced the entire mistake to a phrase understood immediately across generations and political loyalties: she touched his mother. The point was not that families should immunize a public official from criticism because Rubio's policies remained open to attack, but that invoking a deceased immigrant mother as a theatrical instrument had violated a cultural boundary. Ocasio-Cortez should have understood better than most politicians. She had tried to convert Rubio's family history into evidence against him, and he had answered by converting her campaign history into evidence against her. The phrase became shorthand for the strategic blunder that had transformed a favorable confrontation into a financial crisis, because even viewers who knew nothing about LLC reporting understood who had chosen to make the exchange personal. Ocasio-Cortez had controlled the opening, the pacing, the subject, and the emotional frame, yet she surrendered every advantage the moment she dragged Orioles Rubio into a policy dispute. From then forward, Rubio no longer appeared to be avoiding questions about immigration or Cuba because he appeared to be a son defending a mother who had been publicly used after death. That moral reversal made the binder more powerful, since viewers who might otherwise have dismissed its contents as partisan opposition research now listened because they believed Rubio had earned the right to respond. The Congresswoman had not merely made an offensive remark, she had supplied the emotional permission required for millions of people to hear evidence they might previously have ignored. By the third week, the Justice Department's Public Integrity Section had sent a preliminary inquiry letter to Ocasio-Cortez's campaign treasurer requesting documentation related to the brand new Congress LLC payments to Dr. B. It was not a subpoena, an indictment, or a formal declaration that a criminal investigation had begun, and the distinction mattered because accuracy remained essential even in a confrontation this politically explosive. Yet the letter represented something more serious than another television segment, watchdog complaint, or online argument, because federal prosecutors do not request campaign records merely to participate in a news cycle. A preliminary inquiry is the government's quietest instrument, the bureaucratic knock delivered before anyone knows whether the door will later be forced open. It says that officials are looking, that records must be preserved, and that the explanations previously offered to reporters may eventually have to survive a setting where misleading language carries consequences. The campaign now faced a timeline rather than a headline, and timelines are dangerous because they connect documents that political offices prefer to discuss separately. The old LLC payments, the 3-3 FEC deadlock, the new psychiatrist complaint, the leadership training descriptions, Rubio's televised reading, and the campaign's vague declaration of full compliance no longer existed as isolated controversies. They had become successive entries in a single record, each one giving investigators a reason to compare what had been reported publicly with what the internal documents might show. News stories disappear beneath newer stories, but a case file grows heavier every time another invoice, email, contract, or witness statement is added. Ocasio-Cortez could attack the motives behind the inquiry, but motive would not alter a date, rewrite a disbursement, or transform a psychiatric service into campaign consulting after the fact. Then Rosa Gutierrez appeared on a local Queens cable station and spoke for roughly 30 seconds in Spanish, without consultants, legal phrasing, or the protective fog of congressional language. She said she had given $25 every month because she believed the money supported the community, and she asked why any of it had gone to a psychiatrist. The clip received around 3 million views, a modest number compared with national viral totals, but an enormous audience for a local interview centered on one donor in one district. Rosa did what Ocasio-Cortez's opponents could not do because she stripped the dispute of party labels and returned it to the basic relationship between a campaign and the people financing it. She was not a Republican strategist, a Rubio advisor, or a federal commissioner. She was the kind of constituent Ocasio-Cortez had repeatedly claimed to represent, and she no longer understood what her money had purchased. That question struck directly at the slogan that had once helped build the Congresswoman's bond with Latino voters, "She is like us." For years, the phrase had suggested shared work, shared pressure, shared immigrant experience, and shared suspicion of a political system that demands perfection from ordinary people while excusing ambiguity among the powerful. After the hearing, the phrase acquired a harsher test because being like Rosa meant filing forms accurately, naming expenses honestly, and explaining where donated money went without hiding behind professional language. Like us meant that a $200 discrepancy could not be dismissed as politically motivated, so $900,000 certainly could not be brushed aside with a sentence statement. Like us meant that donors deserved more than confidence. They deserved clarity, especially when the campaign receiving their sacrifice had built its moral authority on condemning secrecy, privilege, and institutional double standards. Marco Rubio had cleaned rooms at the Rooney Plaza Hotel while Rosa Gutierrez ran a laundromat in Corona, and the two women had never met. Yet the logic connecting them was impossible to miss. Both understood the discipline of physical work, the humiliation of being scrutinized over every dollar, and the necessity of calling a service by its correct name, because working people do not receive unlimited chances to revise paperwork after questions begin. Ocasio-Cortez had invoked one of those women to condemn Rubio, then discovered that the other represented the audience most injured by the records he read. The Congresswoman thought she was exposing a son who had betrayed his mother's sacrifices, but the binder redirected that accusation toward a campaign accused of betraying the trust of donors who made similar sacrifices. That reversal was not created by Rubio's volume, theatrics, or political skill alone. It was created by Ocasio-Cortez's decision to cross a personal line while standing beside financial disclosures she was not prepared to explain. The final lesson of the hearing was therefore brutally simple, and no amount of ideological framing could soften it. Do not weaponize a dead mother unless every line in your own record can survive the response. One mistake threatened an election because voters remember cruelty, while the other threatens something more severe because federal forms create obligations that outrage, apologies, and viral statements cannot erase. Ocasio-Cortez entered the room expecting to produce a clip in which Marco Rubio appeared ashamed of the distance between his family history and his public policies. She left having apologized for the attack, declined to answer the $900,000, watched watchdogs demand renewed scrutiny, and faced inquiries into payments that her campaign had described in language millions of viewers now questioned. She wanted a viral moment, but Rubio gave her a public record, and by the time the binder closed, the insult that was supposed to damage him had become the first line of a case built around it.